Thanks, Rachel, and it's great to be here. This paper that you're going to hear is coming out actually in December in Demography. Although, and my collaborators are Larry Wu, my colleague at NYU, and Emily Schaefer, my former student, now at Portland State. Actually, I can't, it doesn't have this title in Demography. Larry would never let me say something so provocative, but I feel like it gives audiences that are going to hear it some idea of sort of one of the punchlines. So here's what I'm going to do. First, I'm going to describe trends in premarital conceptions and premarital first births for American cohorts of women, born 1920, and then I only have them up to 1965, data limitation, and then assess the role of two kinds of retreat from marriage in these trends. What I'm calling preconception marriage, that is, you get married and you are not pregnant at the time. And what we're calling post-conception marriage, which has colloquially been called shotgun marriages, where you are pregnant and you get married. And those are two kinds of marriage, and we can have trends going on towards less of either of those that could affect the probability of a woman having a premarital birth. Then I want to speculate about the causes of these trends, partly based on knowledge of what was going on around the periods when these cohorts would have been conceiving or deciding to marry. Here is a graph that you will see later, but just let's get your mind fixed on this, because this is sort of the central empiric. You could say these are the stylized facts. Now, it says up there it's a predicted trend, but if I had given you the raw descriptives, it would look almost identical, as you'll see later. So let me just decode this graph a little bit. First of all, the blue line is whites and the red line is blacks. We're only going to look at those two racial groups. We're doing separate analyses for them. And this is not the usual statistic you're used to seeing about non-marital births. You're used to seeing a ratio of the number of non-marital births to marital births for a given cohort or a given year. That's not what this is. This is taking women in a birth cohort and saying what proportion of them ever experienced a birth before their first marriage, okay? And it was their first birth. Now, you might look at this and say, well, it's low and flat for whites, but this really isn't flat. It's kind of forced by my putting blacks and whites on the same graph, because this thing goes from about 3% of women born about 1920 experienced that to about 11%. So it more than tripled, okay? And, it's continued up since. For blacks, there's always been this big gap, but the trend is also upward. It starts at about 21% for this cohort and ends up for the cohort born in 65 at about 50%. That's what proportion of women experience a first premarital birth. Actually, this is by age 25, but most of the action is done by age 25. So if we had taken age 35, these things just inch up a tiny bit. So the central thing I want to get your head around is actually not what stares you in the face in this graph, the race difference, about which I will have not too much to say today, because that's not what this paper is about, but that both of these things are going monotonically upward. And really, the real point I really want to make on the descriptive level is they have been going upward for a long, long, long time, since people born in about 1920 who would have been having these conceptions or births in about 1940, okay? So what are the, I'll give you the 2-minute lit review. What arguments have been made about trends in, we'll say, non-marital births more generally? Well, one is, this kind of echoes my sex and the economy. One is you had a sexual revolution, more people are having premarital sex. So, ceteris paribus, you probably get more premarital babies. On the other hand, the sexual revolution comes in at about the same time that you get both the pill and abortion coming online. So, in a way, those things kind of break the connection, or at least the necessary connection between sex and babies. So, it's not entirely clear how much more sex will lead to more births. but it might. The second is an argument about marriage more generally, but it's often couched in terms of marriageable men. Now, when we hear this argument associated with people like Wilson and Neckerman, and then a more geeky demographic version of it is in an important paper by Herb Smith and Phil Morgan and another person whose name I've forgotten. The idea here is if something makes men less marriageable, now it could also be anything else creates a retreat from marriage, so that you get less marriage or later marriage, that just lengthens the time during which a woman is exposed to the risk of having a premarital birth, right? So like if I'm married, I can't have a premarital birth anymore. So other things equal, anything that creates a retreat from marriages happening before conceptions will create, or could, create more premarital births. And the argument's been made really for a more recent period that, well, men have become, especially men on the bottom, less marriageable, and then that may be what's driving the retreat from marriage. Now, the other argument that's been made is about shotgun marriages. And there's an important article by Akerlof et al. Where they argue that after abortion became legal, men didn't feel they had to marry women. Now, and they have some empirics showing that the proportion of premarital conceptions that turned into marriages plummeted. They're using period rather than cohort, but sort of across the 70s and 80s. And their empirics are correct. I think their story is wrong. I mean, a lot of the other literature since has made it very clear that it's not like these women that get pregnant are just dying usually to marry these guys. They usually also think that this isn't a good enough reason to marry. But the point is something has happened such that we've seen this real reduction in responding to a conception with a shotgun marriage, and of course that will also up the number of premarital births. Now, I actually think an alternative explanation of why people may have shotgun marriages less is that part of what was driving this in the past was that it was so stigmatizing for the woman to reveal that she had had premarital sex. Once premarital sex is fairly ubiquitous in a large proportion of the population, that's one less reason to get married if you get pregnant. All right, so what are we going to do? The data that we use are from the June CPS fertility, what is it usually called? Fertility histories. So we're pulling across, these were done every 5 years, and the reason we can't go forward more in time is because they kept doing them, but they've stopped asking about the first birth. They've just asked about the recent birth and maybe one other or something like that. So this series, which was so useful, doesn't exist anymore. But we can get from these a wide swath of birth cohorts. So we know about each woman, what year she was born, figured out by the survey minus her age. And we know the date of her first marriage to the month and year and the date of her first birth. We're running separate models for whites and blacks. So we subtract 9 months from a birth to get what we say is the date of conception. That's approximate. Then we decide, is this a premarital conception, by then going and saying, when does she say her first marriage was? And if it seems to have occurred before the first marriage, we're going to call it a premarital conception. And if there was an abortion, we don't know about the conception. So when I say conception, I mean a conception subsequently taken to term, which my co-author likes to put in every sentence containing the word conception, and we had a little debate about this. So we're going to call a marriage a post-conception marriage, aka shotgun marriage, if the first birth occurred within 7 months. So we're sort of giving the benefit of the doubt that you could have a 2-month preemie. This is standard in the literature. So here's kind of the, on a geeky level, conceptual model. Because we will, because the first thing that we'll actually be estimating in this model is who had a conception. And then there's a second stage about who's shotgunned versus who had a premarital birth. That's why. Because we're interested in decomposing the trends in premarital birth into how much is driven by trends in conception versus how much is driven by trends in do you marry in response to a conception. And, great setup question, Marta, I could have paid you for that. And the first stage here is really, if you think about it, it took us a while to get this through our heads that, you know, you aren't really at risk for a premarital conception when you're married, and so you have to first talk about a competing risk of which happens first. You conceive, in parentheses, a conception that's subsequently taken to term, or you marry not preceded by such a conception. And so we're going to do a hazard model where the independent variables are essentially cohorts to estimate that. Then we're going to just take the conceptions, and then at a second stage, we're going to do a simple logistic regression to see how does cohort affect, did you go on and have the birth outside of marriage, or did you marry before the birth? And this stuff out here, you know, marital first births, we're not dealing with that. So the technical details, which Larry's more of an expert on than me, is that it's a competing hazard, so we've got these two baseline hazards. We're really using a piecewise splined Gompertz to mimic a Cox model, and ages the clock and the starting at 12, and we're allowing that the hazard to change its slope at 18, 21, and 25. So then, okay, this is a real simple model with cohort dummies are the main covariates. Race enters just by separate models for blacks and whites. Now you might say, well, why don't we have a lot of covariates in here? You know, where are all the control variables? Well, in my defense, I can say only two things. A, cohort is exogenous. And B, the reason we can't put in all these rich covariates, which we know are actually there in the CPS, is that the way we're able to get this, sometimes we have a woman 60 years old in the CPS telling us about the month in which she first married and first had her kid, from which we're doing all this little arithmetic to figure out the conceptions and stuff. And yes, we know her family income now, but it's 40 years later. We know her education now. We know is she married now. We know what's her husband's education now. How many kids does she have? But that's not, we can't use that. So that's why there's very few covariates. So then we have to do this fitted value exercise. I mean, you run these regressions and you get a million coefficients and you can't really interpret them. And what we want to know is how did cohort, by the way, when I say cohort here, you know, this is not an APC model, so we're taking cohort change, it makes some combination of cohort or period effects, and we're not trying to break that out. Although we could, we're actually identified, but you don't want to go there. So what's straightforward is the probability that neither of these two events happens at the first stage. You get married before a conception, or you have this conception first. Getting sort of fitted values, you know, like you do in a logit just by telling Stata to do it, for a hazard model in event history turns out to be non-trivial. And Larry's worked this out, and the math is in the appendix, which you can read. But we've estimated this model, and it actually fits the descriptives very well, because after all, we only have cohort as variable in here. So really, we're sort of adjusting for age. But so what we're going to do with fitted values is say by age 25 for each cohort, black and white women separately, do we observe what proportion of the women had, by age 25, a premarital conception, a first marriage not preceded by a conception that was taken to term, or neither. So, 2 key points. Remember this exposure point, because we're going to use this to do some sort of not a simulation, but counterfactuals from the data, bit of value exercises. All else equal, a rise in the age of marriage implies more years of risk to a premarital conception. So we can do some fitted values where we say, well, what if the hazard, the age-specific hazards of having a first marriage not preceded by a conception stayed at their 1925 level, at the first cohort level. Hold that where it is, but let the other side of the hazard trend as the model says it does across cohorts. How much of the rise in conceptions is explained by one versus the other? So that's the kind of exercise we're going to do. The strong assumption, of course, always in these competing hazard models, is that there's no joint endogeneity of the 2 hazards. One could certainly argue that point. Then at the second stage, we're just going to do this logistic regression. You have a conception before marriage. Do you marry before the birth or not? How's that affected by cohort? And there we put age in dummies. Okay, so let's look at some results. So I'm going to show you white women here. And for these graphs, unlike the graph I showed you at the very beginning, I am going to put white women and black women on a different scale just so we can see what's going on better. So here is the actual descriptive trend, not of premarital births, which is what we were looking at the beginning, but of premarital conceptions. Now, as I talk about these results, it's often really convenient to just sort of lump these cohorts into 2 groups. And I'm going to call, from the beginning up through here, the pre-baby boom, in terms of when the women having the births were born. And then I'm going to call this on the baby boom, all right? So you can just think of it as the front half, left half and the right half of the graph. So what really happened with conceptions is the proportion of women who had a conception before they got married first time, remembering I don't know about them if they didn't take them to term, but there aren't too many abortions back here, went up in the pre-baby boom from 8% to about 16% for white women. Then they actually kind of flatten off. So you might say, well, out here is when we're supposed to have had the sexual revolution, right? But we also had the contraceptive revolution. So I think this flattening out is that, just think of abortion here as a very effective means of birth control. If we count abortion and birth control, I think it's basically that you got the pill and abortion out there, and that's why the conceptions could flatten out, even though we know from other evidence that premarital sex was going up, or at least that age at first intercourse was going down. So that's the raw descriptive. So now if we just run the model of the competing hazard and get the predicted value for the conception side of it for each cohort, there it is. So it fits the descriptives very well. Now we're going to do the sort of counterfactual exercise. So this purple line is, suppose you had, as we do the fitted values, let the trend in premarital conception on that side of the hazard trend as it did, according to the model, but hold the hazard of having a marriage before a conception at its first cohort level. So hold one of them and let the other trend. What happens? Well, almost nothing. I mean, you might not call that entirely nothing, but it looks pretty similar to the other 2 lines. Now, suppose we do the opposite. We let marriage, I'm sorry, did I say this backwards? Yeah, no, this is no trend in marriage. So the point is, if we keep how early people married before a conception not changing at all, we still get pretty much like the same thing for what happens with the proportion of people having conceptions. That suggests to me that a retreat from marriage is not really what's going on here. That is, it's not what's driving the conceptions. Now, if we do the exercise the opposite way, we let marriage trend as it did, but the conception side of the hazard hold it at its first cohort, then we get almost no increase. So this seems clearly to be saying the increase in conceptions comes from an increase in the age-specific risk of the hazard of conception, not increased more prolonged exposure to the risk of hazards. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. All right, so now let's look at the same thing for blacks. There's descriptive and fitted, letting both trend as they did. Now here, you see that for blacks in the baby boom, there is a little bit of action off the retreat from marriage in explaining, in other words, when you don't let marriage trend, you don't get this thing going up as much as it did in some of this later period. So the exposure to more non-marriage is explaining some of conceptions. On the other hand, it's not explaining most of it, because you see this is what you get without letting the conception side of the thing. So the conclusion on the conception side of things is that before the baby boom, almost none of it comes from increased exposure to marriage. For the cohorts after, a minor share of it does, especially for blacks, come from more exposure to non-marriage. Okay, so the interesting thing here is the increase in the first half, right? This is before the putative sexual revolution. Excuse me. So the fact that a lot of change in conceptions is occurring before the sexual revolution, and certainly before the fall in men's marriageability, it's not fitting the usual stories of timing. And the main cause is not a retreat from preconception marriage. Okay, so now let's go to stage 2. So we're now just looking at the women who had a premarital conception that was taken to term. And this is, it doesn't matter whether you take the modeled from the logistic regression or the descriptives, they're virtually identical. So the top line is for whites and the black line is for blacks. And this is simply what % of women who found themselves pregnant before their first marriage with their first child married before the birth. So one interesting thing here is the shotgun marriage thing has always been more common among whites, conditional on finding themselves in that situation, than blacks. But once again, the trends are amazingly similar. And basically, it's somewhat flat for the pre-baby boom. So there wasn't much trend in, there was a pretty consistent tendency for about 30% of blacks and 60% of whites to respond if they got pregnant by marrying before the birth. But then it plummets for both groups with the gap between the races staying. Now, I want to kind of put stage 1 and stage 2 together. And we put them together just through a kind of spreadsheet accounting exercise. In other words, we have these fitted values about, under these different assumptions about what's allowed to change and what isn't. How many people had conceptions before a marriage, and then we're going to add the fitteds from these logistic regressions. So what I'm going to focus in here, there's lots of moving parts, but is just the additional question that hasn't been discussed yet of how much did this trend downward in the baby boom period, women in responding to a conception with a shotgun marriage, how much did that contribute to the increase in premarital births. So now I'm going out to the final outcome of the actual premarital births. In this case, I'm going to start with black women because their story is a little cleaner on this issue. So there's the descriptive. It's a descriptive, just the raw descriptive. Then the next thing I put in is running both of those models, but letting cohorts trend as they did and get the fitted values off that and do the spreadsheet calculation between level one, the two stages. So we've got this upward trend in premarital birth. So now the simulation is, what if the only thing that changed is we kept the proportion of black women who were having a shotgun marriage if they got pregnant before marriage at its 1925 level. So it doesn't change anything for the pre-baby boom because, as you recall, the shotgunning wasn't moving, right? But out here, it's actually explaining quite a bit of the increase subsequent to, for the later cohorts. Do the same thing for white women. Here's their raw increase. Here's the modeled. And if we do this, now it's a little more confusing for them because I didn't emphasize it, but really their shotgunning went up a little bit in the pre-baby boom. So it was sort of like anti-explaining things. But if you sort of took this and moved it down to here, then you can see you get sort of the same thing you did for black women, that it does, you do have a bigger increase than you would have had had they not stopped shotgunning so much. So let me try to wrap up and put this all together and think about what it means a little bit. The pre-baby boom upward trend in premarital first birth is explained mostly by an upward trend in conceptions, not prolonged exposure to the risk of conception. So another way to say that is that the retreat from preconception marriage wasn't a factor. And we also saw that the retreat from shotgunning, because it didn't exist, there was no retreat from that, also doesn't explain that. So for the pre-baby boom women, the story about why you got more premarital births over time is that more women were having a conception. That, age-specific hazards were going up. So our conclusion here, this is where the sex and economy come back in, is the most obvious explanation is that there must have been some slow, long-term increase in the proportion of people having premarital sex before the putative sexual revolution. I mean, one could come up with other possible stories. You can ask about them in the Q&A, but this seems like the most obvious one. For the baby boom, the upward trend in premarital births is affected by the trends in marriage two ways. One is, the main one is that people stopped having these shotgun marriages given a premarital conception. And that had a big effect for blacks and whites. To a smaller extent, and particularly for blacks, there was a little bit of this increased exposure to non-marriage, kicking up conceptions. But that's definitely kind of the minor part of the story. So it seems to me then, let me back up and say, if you go to the ASA, not necessarily the PAA, but if you go to the ASA and you just sort of grab a sociologist in the hall and say, well, why do you think non-marital births have gone up? Doug, can you check me on this? That most people will say something about the economy and well, yeah, they will. Yeah, right. So it seems to me that this is inconsistent with that as the main driver for a few different reasons. I mean, first of all, the baby boom trend is caused by a change in marriage, but it's mostly post-conception marriage. Now you could say, well, that's still a retreat from marriage. But surely if men are becoming less marriageable, that might affect, do you get married if you find yourself pregnant, but surely it should affect preconception marriages even more, because after all, post-conception marriages are a little bit more of a response to a crisis. Secondly, the time trend is just way off here and doesn't acknowledge how long-standing these increases in premarital births and premarital conceptions are. I mean, if they're happening from the cohorts starting born in 1920, can we possibly argue that, let's take white men, that white men have been getting monotonically less marriageable starting with the cohorts born in 1920? I mean, if you by the way, these conceptions and births are typically happening in all cohorts at about ages 18, 19, and 20. So if you want to, just add 20 to the birth cohort, and you'll get about when this stuff was happening. If you want to think, well, when is this actually going on? So, do we think that white men were getting monotonically less marriageable through the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and I'll grant you anything past 73 maybe, but not, in that period, I think it's hard to argue. And for black men too, actually, their earnings relative to white men, for black men, the evidence is more ambiguous because employment's been going down for a really, really long time, but earnings, conditional unemployment, was going up pretty robustly in the 50s and 60s. But this trend is there for whites as well as for blacks, So it seems to me that this idea that marriageable men is the main story, or even marriage, doesn't really work. So then what is the explanation? So, our somewhat speculative interpretation is that it's something about a rise in sexual behavior even pre-baby boom. And when I think about, well, why do I think that happened, I don't know. I kind of fall back on Sociology 101 stories like rise of individualism or, the automobile or decline in surveillance capacities of parents or, urbanization so that you have less social capital with, all the moms on the block watching what everybody else is doing, or something like that. Then, once you get ubiquitous or almost ubiquitous premarital sex, then I think it will follow from that the shotgun marriages will go down because it's not so stigmatizing. If it's not so stigmatizing to have had sex, it's not going to be so stigmatizing to have a child out of wedlock. Now, we suspect premarital sex increased in all social classes. We don't have good data on this, but more conceptions happened in lower SES groups where, at least we know in the present data, contraception is much less consistent. Now, I'm going to end with two graphs that break up this data by education. And the reason this actually isn't in the paper is that there's a deep flaw in using education from these data. Remember that the education of the woman may be being measured 40 years after the birth, right? Sometimes 1 year after, sometimes 5, sometimes 10, sometimes 40. So the education could be endogenous to having had the birth. But I couldn't resist looking at it anyhow, because we know today that non-marital births are wildly disproportionate at low SES levels among both whites and blacks. No one has actually ever shown was that true all the way back. And these data, even with this deeply flawed education measure, give us some idea about that. So what you have here is the proportion having the premarital conception, since I'm saying conceptions kind of drove things, at least in the early period. So this is white women who were college grads, up to high school dropouts. So the interesting thing to me is, all the way back here, it's a very disproportionately low SES thing. So when I say it's not, I don't want to over-exaggerate this, it's not about the economy. I'm saying the trend upward seems not to be about some trend in the economic marriageability of men. However, it has always been the case that something is going on where the more disadvantaged are experiencing this more. And you get a similar thing for blacks. The levels are up, but you see this similar education gradient. So that's like a little caveat to say you know, I'm not saying nothing about advantage and disadvantage has anything to do with this. But to explain the trend, I think trends in the economy does not seem to work very well as an explanation. Therefore, it seems to be maybe that trends in sexual behavior have more to do with it. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. You know, I already said this. Oh, that's because I'm going backwards. So let's discuss.